Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Wickman. I hold the University Professorship of English at Brigham University, and I'm a member of the SSCS. I'm talking today with Mina Cho, who's an associate teaching professor at Georgetown University and a scholar of constructive theology and Christian spirituality. Mina is a native of South Korea who studied at both Korean and American institutions. She earned her master's of theology at Duke University and her PhD at Emory University. She also recently published a fascinating book we'll discuss titled The Silent God and the Silenced, Mysticism and Contemplation Amid Suffering. Mina, it's great to be able to have you on this little segment to discuss these five questions with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation.
Sure. So I'll begin here. My first question here. I'm interested in what brought you from South Korea to the United States, um, and as a scholar, what brought you to the field of Christian spirituality.
Oh yeah, I have never been somebody who maps everything out in advance. I did not come to the US with a clear academic plan. And I think I still do. I have usually tried to respond to what seemed necessary and good in front of me and just to stay open to where that might lead. When I was in college in South Korea, the country was politically turbulent. So I joined the student protest and after college and graduate school, and I worked in human rights, especially with the survivors of Japanese military sexual slavery. And that work really changed me. And trauma survivors to teach you something, no book, could teach. But the work was so physically and emotionally exhausting. So I came to the US in the year 2000 and almost as a kind of, a sabbatical for myself. And I thought I would just study for a while and finish a master's degree and then return to activist work. I had no plan to pursue a PhD. But at Duke Divinity School, something unexpected happened. So I fell in love with mystical literature, its beauty and intensity and strange honesty about God and desire. And at Emory, I studied medieval women mystics and found wonderful teachers. And because mystical literature is so deeply tied to liturgy, so I began attending Catholic Mass to understand, the word more fully, and eventually I became Catholic myself. So all these, things, life experiences, and my path into Christian spirituality was just not linear. So it came through activism and exhaustion and migration and beauty, liturgy, and the mystics.
Okay, good. I'm glad you said that exhaustion was part of that, and I like that. Okay, good. All right. So here's my second question for you. So you're a scholar of constructive theology as well as Christian spirituality, and I'm wondering whether the connection between those fields is intuitive and obvious for you, or whether they complicate each other in some way. I guess what I'm really asking, it's really about Christian spirituality. Do you see this as an academic field like other fields? Or something about Christian spirituality that both enhances but also disrupts and or redirects how we approach other fields, like constructive theology.
I love the question indeed, because I still explore the relationship between constructive theology and a study of spirituality. As you said, at Emory, I was trained in constructive theology, and before Emory at Duke, I was trained as an ethicist. But while writing on Hedwig, I became more and more drawn to Christian mysticism and spirituality and later, and teaching at St. Catherine University, St. Paul, Minnesota, I taught both theology and spirituality. And I began to realize that spirituality was the place where I felt more intellectually and personally alive. And I would say for me, constructive theology and Christian spirituality are deeply, interconnected, but they move kind of, differently. And I think constructive theology, at least for me, gives me structure, like a concepts and arguments and ways of organizing different questions. And I still rely on that training. But spirituality begins closer to the ground. So, it begins with prayer and suffering and desire and embodiment and community, justice, ordinary life, and exhaustion too. And in that, how do people actually encounter the divine or, the absence of divine in the concrete conditions of, their life? And I think, both fields need each other. Um, and theology needs and gives grammar and structure, and spirituality listens for the experiences and ambiguity and mystery. And I think also that's why spirituality can also disrupt the academy. And I think it asks questions, like, whose pain and are we not hearing? And what experiences have we dismissed because they do not fit our, normative category? And where is God being encountered outside the place we expected? So yeah, for me, those two fields, I need them together.
I love that. That's a very thoughtful response, and it leads actually really well to the third question I have for you, which is about your terrific book, "The Silent God and the Silenced." Um, there are so many directions in which to go as a scholar of Christian spirituality. What led you to take up the subject of silence in particular?
I guess the book began with my life experiences and especially the tension I could not just easily let go of. Silence can be mystical and contemplative, but it can also be, violent, coercive. So, on the one hand, in the mystical tradition, silence is not emptiness or failure. It's a prayer, supreme prayer. It can be, a form of a presence and attention and surrender to God. It can open us to God beyond our need to explain, control, or even possess. That is the silence, I learned from the mystics and also from my experience in the religious community. But there is also another kind of silence, the silence that imposed on the people whose voices are ignored, erased, or even made dangerous. And this silence is not chosen. It's painful. It's not a peaceful kind of silence. And I guess my own life made me attentive to both. I live within Korean, language and English, so I'm kind of familiar with the junctures, the words where language could not, engage. And also, my work with, those silenced, the trauma survivors and immigrants and women of color and LGBTQI plus individuals and their silence. They carry, fear, grief, anger, but also dignity and memories. And those things you cannot capture in words. So somehow the tension between these two silences, that's yeah, kind of led me to write the book.
Okay, great. That's a good, actually, a way to lead into that in the fourth question I have. So you discuss in the book how the silence of God can be difficult and unsettling, but that learning how to sit with that silence allows us also to sit in solidarity with those who suffer, right? Including those people who are traditionally marginalized. You mentioned several in your last response to me. In this way, learning how to reckon with the silence of God can be ethically and spiritually instructive in how we receive others. Can you help us understand better how the silence of God, helps us to be more open to the suffering and the silences of others? Or how the openness of silence in God helps us to understand better the coercive silence that constrains others?
I think it teaches us to stay, to remain, not to rush, and not to be obsessed with, a sense of certainty. Life is full of uncertainty, and there are a lot of things we cannot understand. We need to somehow stay with them. And when you meet someone in deep pain, and we often want to say something useful, just like, Job's friends, we want to explain, we want to offer comfort, and sometimes you want to fix, and you think we can do, and we move, the story toward, hope. But sometimes that urgency, I doubt that if it is about, our own discomfort. And we want our suffering to become meaningful too quickly. But oftentimes when suffering becomes a meaning, it needs time. It takes life sometimes. It takes lifetime. The silence of God unsettles, I think, this impulse, and it strips away, our need to control the scene. And then, again, it teaches us to stay. And yeah, I think it's also what the story of Holy Saturday teaches us. Just like disciples, we stay there without even knowing what will happen next. And the belief that, God is still there, not above the silence, not outside it, but inside the silence, God is there.
I think your book does a great job of explaining those things and bringing them out. So I recommend that book highly to everybody who's looking at this video.
Thank you.
Um, so here's my fifth and final question for you. What is next for you as a scholar of Christian spirituality? And what's next for you as a person who tries to cultivate a strong spiritual life?
Thank you for the question. Um, I live at a kind of crossroads in Korea and the United States and the academia and the field and Protestantism and Catholicism and activism and contemplation in many ways. Yeah, I want to keep writing and teaching from that across the place. And I'm especially, drawn into ordinary stories of people who are struggling and enduring and surviving and still finding grace. And I want to listen more close to what happens outside the classroom, at the borders, in communities, in the war-torn areas, and in places where people carry pain that often remains unseen, and bring those stories to the classroom and to my own writing. So I guess my next book continues this concern. And I think, the awareness I also want to keep all the time is um, I myself am an immigrant and also a woman of color, but I also, speak from institutional privilege. So that awareness and the sense of, how much I owe people who struggle every day, and how much I needed to be humble before their presence at work. And those things, I always want to carry in my writing and in my teaching. And I think, at that crossroad, and that's where I'm trying to live, with more attention and more accountability and more openness to be changed by people and places I encounter.
I love that. Yeah, blessings to you in your future work and in your own spiritual life.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.